March 2nd, 2006, somewhere in La Pampa, Argentina. A strange and unnerving incident took place involving a police officer who suddenly went missing. When authorities arrived at the spot where he was last seen, they discovered footprints that led them to an unsettling mystery. It's not often we hear a paranormal story coming straight from law enforcement, but the events of that night shook this officer so deeply that he eventually resigned from the force. Skeptical? Hear him out and decide for yourself. Did he encounter some kind of animal, a human being, or something else so terrifying that it drove him away from his career? La Pampa is known for its wide-open spaces and has its share of strange tales. If you're fascinated by horror, mystery, and both solved and unsolved cases, go ahead and hit like, and don't forget to subscribe. Let's jump right into the story. It was around 7 p.m. on March 2nd, 2006. Corporal Luis Sergui Puchetta, let's call him Luis, served with a local police force in La Pampa, Argentina. He'd been assigned to patrol El Cruz de las Cañas, a long, desolate stretch of road flanked by tall grass and dense trees on both sides. Hardly anyone traveled there, and there were no nearby houses. The reason his department monitored it was because of poachers, illegal hunters who came from various parts of Argentina to capture or kill local wildlife, selling their haul on the black market for a hefty profit. Luis was accustomed to patrolling this road alone on his motorcycle. After hours of riding back and forth along the isolated route, he spotted two red lights in the distance. Lights he assumed were the tail lamps of a vehicle. He slowed down to keep watch, waiting to see what might happen. Within minutes, that vehicle veered off into the tall grass, where there was no clear path. That's when Luis became convinced they must be poachers, likely ducking out of sight because they'd noticed his presence. He immediately rode to the spot where the vehicle had disappeared, parked his bike, and got off with his hand already resting on his sidearm. Moving carefully from where he stood, he walked slowly toward the area where he was certain the vehicle had turned. On reaching the section of the road he believed the car had left, he grew puzzled. None of the grass was flattened, and there were no tire marks. He checked thoroughly for any sign of tracks, but found nothing. Still, he was sure the vehicle had turned right there. Rather than wait idly, Luis radioed his station, gave them his location, and asked for backup. Then, using one hand to brush aside tall grasses, while his other hand stayed firmly on his gun, he ventured into the thick foliage. After a few minutes of pushing through dense undergrowth, he came upon an area where large trees stood close together. By moonlight, he saw something shiny. At first, he thought it could be the suspicious vehicle, glinting because the moonlight reflected off its surface. Taking cover behind a tree, he listened carefully for voices or an engine, but after a few seconds of silence, he stepped out. The moment he got a clear look at that shiny object, his entire body froze. In a split second, he realized it wasn't a car. Whatever it was filled him with such dread that he couldn't move a muscle. Nighttime insects and animals grew louder as panic closed in on him. He tried to scream, his mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Meanwhile, in a nearby town, one of Luis's fellow officers, who was off duty, was about to turn in for the night when his phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Luis, unusual since Luis rarely used his phone while on duty. Picking up, the off-duty officer asked what was wrong, but instead of answering, Luis, in a chilling monotone, simply said, "Go to Las Cañas. You know what to do," and hung up before the other could respond. For the next few minutes, the off-duty officer tried calling Luis back, but got no answer. Worried, he called their station to ask about Luis. They confirmed he had gone out to Las Cañas and, concerningly, they'd been unable to reach him via radio. He'd previously requested backup for a suspicious vehicle he thought might be carrying poachers and had gone to investigate. Soon after, 3 police units arrived in Las Cañas and found Luis's motorcycle near the side of the road. But no trace of Luis. They repeatedly tried to contact him over the radio, with no luck. Searching the area around his motorcycle, they discovered some of his equipment, his radio and his sidearm, both taken apart and left on the ground. No one could explain why he would do that. Hoping for a clue, they followed footprints that appeared to be Luis's, leading deeper into a wooded area. About 100 feet in, they noticed something disturbing. Each set of his footprints, left foot then right foot, grew farther apart the more they advanced. Initially, they supposed he might have been running, which can lengthen a stride. But after tracking them for nearly 4 kilometers, the distance between the prints stretched from 5 feet to 10, then 15, and eventually over 20 feet. By then, the officers weren't even sure these were human footprints anymore, let alone those of their missing corporal. They retraced their steps in case they'd missed something, but only found the same puzzling trail, a left print, then a right print 20 feet away. It seemed as though whatever made these tracks stood impossibly tall, or else had an inhuman stride. By this point, the officers had stopped speaking to each other as they pressed on. Nobody knew where these footprints would lead. Eventually, they reached a cornfield and found that the tracks just ended, like Luis had lifted his right foot for another stride and vanished. For hours, they searched the area around that final footprint, but to no avail. Heavy rain began to fall around 2 a.m., forcing them to halt the search. Adding to the confusion, no one had spotted or heard any vehicle in the area, leaving them with no idea what might have happened to Corporal Puchetta. They also couldn't explain how the footprints could have such enormous spacing. Around 4 p.m. the next day, March 3rd, more than 12 hours after Puchetta's disappearance, a farmer roughly 20 kilometers from where Luis's motorcycle was found noticed something unusual in a muddy patch on his land. Approaching it slowly, at first he thought it was a black animal crouched in the muck. As he came closer, he realized it was a man huddled in the mud, knees pulled to his chest. The farmer recognized the uniform as that of a local police officer. Alarmed, he attempted to speak to the figure. "Are you all right? What happened? How did you get here?" But the man just stared blankly, unresponsive, eyes wide open. Startled, the farmer called the emergency line to report that a seemingly catatonic officer was on his property. In minutes, authorities arrived. They confirmed his identity as 31-year-old Corporal Luis Sergui Puchetta, who had been declared missing the night before. Neither the police nor paramedics could get through to him at first, so they notified the station chief, who arrived with regional head and another official. Finally, Luis appeared to recognize them. He broke down in tears, clinging to his chief, utterly unable to speak. Initially suspecting that poachers might have kidnapped and possibly tortured him, they rushed Luis to the hospital. While he had no wounds or bruises, he became extremely distressed whenever the environment was loud or too bright. After several hours, he agreed to an examination. The doctors found no injuries, no cuts, no broken bones. What truly puzzled everyone were the burns on his feet. Even stranger, despite the recent downpour, his clothes and body were completely dry. No one, not even his department's chief, could explain it. When he finally recovered enough to speak, Luis recounted a story so extraordinary that even he admitted it seemed unbelievable. Yet he insisted it was the literal truth. It no longer mattered to him whether others believed. This was what happened. He had stepped out from behind a tree, intending to confront whoever was in the vehicle, only to realize there was no car at all. Instead, hidden among the trees were 4 red, glowing eyes. He couldn't tell if they belonged to 2 people, 2 animals, or something else. All he knew was that those 4 eyes were fixed on him, gradually drawing closer. As they neared, Luis discerned 2 extremely thin, grayish beings with large, elongated heads and spindly fingers. They never blinked, which terrified him. Frozen with fear, he tried to scream, but no sound came out. He then realized he was unable to move any part of his body. Moments later, his limbs began jerking, as if they were dancing without his control. His arms twisted upward, and suddenly he was sprinting backward at a breathtaking speed, still facing the creatures. One of his hands managed to dial the phone number of a friend who was off duty. When the friend answered, all Luis could say in a monotone voice was, "Go to Las Cañas. You know what to do." Then the call ended abruptly. His hand then disconnected the call, disassembled his police radio, and did the same to his firearm. Luis realized that, from the moment his legs started propelling him backward, he was no longer in command of his own body. Whatever these 2 beings were, they appeared to be controlling his movements and toying with him. When he finally finished breaking down his weapon, his terror receded, and he regained control. He turned to run, but he only covered a short distance before a massive force slammed into his back. He found himself floating above the treetops. Rather than being pushed, it felt more like he'd been lifted by these entities. A moment later, he was dropped. He landed on his right foot, but before he could so much as move his left foot, they lifted him again and dropped him once more. This happened repeatedly. So many times he lost count. During this ordeal, the soles of his feet started burning, as though heated by some intense energy. It seemed the beings knew he wanted to flee, but they continued tormenting him. The next thing Luis remembered was running through a cornfield. It appeared his tormentors had let him go. Stopping briefly, he glanced over his shoulder but saw only rows of corn stalks. No sign of the entities. He began running again, only to discover he was suddenly enveloped by complete darkness. No trees, no sky, no corn, no stars, nothing but an endless void. Panicking, he looked around for any sign of an exit. Then he saw 2 red eyes closing in on him, and that was the last thing he remembered. He wasn't sure if he blacked out. The next thing he knew, he was crouched in the muddy field, surrounded by farmers and police officers. Spotting his chief among them, he clung to him and wept uncontrollably. Later, in the hospital, he shared everything he could recall. Concerned for his mental health, the police brought in experts to evaluate him, but every test showed no sign of psychological illness or impairment. Luis himself stopped worrying about whether others believed his story. He simply recounted it as he experienced it. The trauma of that night eventually led Luis to leave the police force and seek another job. Opinions on his ordeal vary. Some suggest it's evidence of mysterious humanoid creatures in our world, while others link it to potential extraterrestrial encounters. Yet however you interpret it, Corporal Luis Sergui Pucheta's story remains one of the most striking accounts of an encounter with beings unlike anything we know. What do you make of the creatures Luis encountered that night? Beings so terrifying they drove him out of law enforcement entirely. Share your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching this chilling account of Corporal Luis's strange experience. What do you think happened that night? Share your theories below. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into the unknown. Stay curious, and see you soon.